and the quantity of these holds never went down. On the contrary, in the face of Iraq's crisis, they continued to grow astronomically. In November 1998, holds on humanitarian contracts came to about $150 million. By May 2002, they reached over $5 billion. So many of Iraq's humanitarian imports were blocked that over the 7-year course of the Oil for Food program, the total humanitarian goods actually delivered to Iraq came to $204 per person per year for everything, including food, medicine, and the infrastructure. Thank you very much. Or about 1/2 the per capita income of Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Were it not for unilateral U.S. holds, the amount of critical humanitarian goods in Iraq would have increased by 1/4, and that would have saved a great many lives. On one occasion, the head of UNICEF identified 18 high-priority contracts that were on hold for 300 water treatment plants affecting 1.5 million people, water tankers which were particularly urgent during the drought that was taking place, and water purification chemicals which were indispensable. Of these 18 contracts, 17 were on hold by the U.S., 1 was on hold by Britain. No one else on the Security Council blocked any of them. On another occasion, the World Health Organization described in detail the drastic shortages of essential drugs and medical supplies. One consequence of this was the inability to treat patients who needed surgery. In 1989, the number of surgeries performed averaged about 15,000 per month. By 1992, this number had dropped to about 5,000, 1/3 the level of surgeries, and remained there for the rest of the decade. But while the need for medical supplies was obviously urgent, the World Health Organization reported that blood bank refrigerators had been blocked, as well as materials to run medical tests and to produce pharmaceuticals. By March 2002, there were 182 contracts in the health sector on hold. 178 of those were being blocked by the U.S., 4 were blocked by the U.K. Again, no one else on the Council blocked anything, any contracts for medical supplies. These practices also undermined all of the humanitarian efforts in Iraq, whether by the government or by NGOs. For example, to increase food production in the face of massive malnutrition, the Iraqi government worked with UN personnel to introduce vaccines for enterotoxemia, a disease found in small ruminants such as sheep and goats that's endemic in Iraq. These animals were critical for producing meat, cheese, and milk. The UN staff found that at least 6 million doses would be necessary for the next vaccination campaign. The U.S. blocked all of these on the grounds that sheep and goat vaccines could be used to produce weapons of mass destruction. The United States invoked dual use and WMD to block every imaginable type of vehicle. This crippled not only food distribution throughout the country, but every other kind of function critical for a modern society. The U.S. blocked tractors on the grounds they might be used by the military. A contract for 1,000 water tankers was blocked on the grounds that they were lined with stainless steel and were therefore WMD dual use. But it wasn't possible to provide potable water in remote areas without these. The U.S. blocked firefighting trucks because the tanks, which held foam to put out fires, were corrosion resistant and therefore might be able to carry chemicals which in turn might conceivably be used to produce chemical weapons. On this reasoning about what constitutes potential weapons of mass destruction, the U.S. blocked olive oil plants, furniture, dental equipment, firemen's suits, and yogurt-making equipment. And there were other rationales that were even more attenuated than those. For example, atropine is a drug that is necessary in any surgery where the patient is put under a general anesthetic. Without atropine, it's not possible to perform an appendectomy, to operate on a cancerous tumor, to surgically repair a hernia, and on and on. But the U.S. objected to Iraq's import of atropine on the grounds that it can also be used as an antidote to nerve gas. The reasoning was it might be used by Iraqi soldiers if they became affected while deploying nerve gas on enemies. So, if we were to block Iraq from getting atropine, this would make it more difficult for Iraq to use nerve gas in warfare. But this involved a level of speculation that was patently ludicrous. Once a soldier inhales nerve gas, he has 2 minutes to self-inject the atropine correctly in the middle of battle before dying of respiratory paralysis. Meanwhile, the UN staff pointed out that the Iraqi military, should they want to deploy nerve gas, had no need for atropine since they had already provided soldiers with gas masks. On the same reasoning, the U.S. objected as well to a number of antibiotics. The U.S. did not claim that the drugs themselves could be used as biological weapons. The rationale was rather that they could be used as an antidote to anthrax, if taken immediately and in large doses. Consequently, the argument went, allowing Iraq to import these antibiotics could indirectly facilitate the use of anthrax, so the U.S. opposed them. Throughout the sanctions regime, these U.S. practices went well beyond the mandate of the Security Council's resolutions and well beyond the will of the rest of the Council members. The Security Council resolutions required the elimination of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, but the goal of the United States was the elimination of Iraq's capacity to produce WMD. While the production of nuclear weapons requires a large and sophisticated production facility, the production of biological and chemical weapons, or at least some of their components, can take place in nothing more than a college chemistry lab or in manufacturing facilities for things like fertilizers and pesticides. To eliminate a nation's capacity to produce biological and chemical weapons means eliminating all science education above the secondary school level, eliminating the capacity to produce yogurt and cheese, or as one biochemist for the Army would have it, eliminating eggs, because egg yolks could be used as a medium in which to grow viruses, which in turn could be used for biological weapons. But any industrialized nation relies continually on manufacturing processes that could possibly be converted to produce some aspect of a biological or a chemical weapon. To eliminate this capacity, as opposed to the weapons themselves, would literally require reducing a nation to the most primitive possible condition and keeping it in those circumstances in perpetuity. That was not at all the policy adopted by the Security Council, which required only that Iraq be subject to partial disarmament and monitoring, but it was the policy of the United States. Many have suggested that the sanctions imposed on Iraq violated international law. Dennis Halliday, the former UN humanitarian coordinator in Iraq, as well as legal scholars, have called it genocide. Others have also maintained that the sanctions constituted war crimes in violation of the Geneva Convention, as well as the norms of jus cogens, the fundamental principles of international law that are unwritten or customary. But neither the International Court of Justice nor the International Criminal Court would have jurisdiction over this situation. For both, the parties to the treaties are states. There is no means by which a state or an individual could bring an action against the Security Council before the ICJ. The ICJ could provide an advisory opinion to the Security Council if it's requested by the Security Council itself. But neither the ICJ nor the ICC could prosecute the Security Council or issue a judgment against it. So it seems that no one could be prosecuted and no state could be found liable for the sanctions regime or for the U.S. role in its implementation. But even if there were a venue with jurisdiction, it does not seem that international law has the capacity to address this kind of atrocity. For genocide, or extermination as a crime against humanity, the actor has to have the specific intent to destroy the group because of its race or ethnicity. Those responsible for this policy would have to have intended to destroy the Iraqis because, and only because, they were Iraqis. It is not sufficient even to destroy the group in its entirety if it is for some other motive. I think that we cannot actually infer the required intent here. While the scale of the human damage was enormous and the damage was conducted systematically, the context suggests a willful blindness and a shockingly high tolerance for collateral damage, but these are not quite the same thing as the specific intent to destroy the Iraqi population. I don't want to suggest that U.S. policymakers were benign in any regard. While within the U.S. policymaking process, there is certainly no evidence of concern about Iraqi children or any other aspect of the suffering in Iraq. The singular preoccupation of U.S. officials was the possibility that Iraq might rebuild its military. It is true that U.S. officials found evidence of this when it seems that no rational person would have, and that they gave no weight at all to the humanitarian consequences of their decisions. But that is not quite the same thing as calculating the destruction of Iraqi civilians, nor is it the same as an intent to annihilate Iraqis because they are Iraqis. A similar question arose in the 1970s, when there was a great deal written by philosophers in response to the Vietnam War. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that the U.S. tactics, such as blanket bombing, the use of napalm, and the systematic burning of villages, amounted to genocide. Hugo Bedeau was sympathetic to the accusation, but in the end refuted it. He argued that however appalling the U.S. policies were, however deliberately and knowingly the atrocities were committed, it could not be shown that this met the specific intent requirement under the Genocide Convention. He concluded with the Scottish verdict, not proven,